Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video I'll be talking about some of the problems I have with Dota 2 as a competitive game, but I want to get a couple of things out of the way before I begin. Firstly, this video should not be seen specifically as an attack on Dota 2. I'm not highly knowledgeable about the other Dota type games, and since I haven't played them I can't really comment on them, but from what I've seen, Dota 2 seems like the best in its genre. I'm singling it out simply because it's the one I've played. Secondly, this is a game which is still in a very active state of development, so there's a good chance some of the things in this video will become outdated in the near future. Although I've spent a large amount of time playing this game, one thing which has never managed to pull me in is the competitive aspect of it. I would hardly say I'm crazy about esports, but I do enjoy them. I've watched plenty of StarCraft, a lot of Quake matches, and even a few fighting game tournaments. Dota, on the other hand, even though it has a huge amount of support from the community and from Valve themselves, has never really managed to get me all that interested. After a lot of reflection, I've identified many of the things I feel cause me to turn away from considering Dota a strong competitive game, even though the teams themselves are obviously very skilled at what they do. The best thing to do is go through all these points one by one, so I'll start with the random elements. First of all, every basic hero attack has a small amount of randomization to it. This has always seemed to me like a holdover from the days of pen and paper RPGs. Since there was no mechanical skill involved in those games, they needed a way to make damage interesting, so chance was used instead. This small modifier on each attack makes sense in some games, like when a player is going to see a number come up on screen indicating how much damage they've done. Nobody wants to see the exact same number come up over and over again. I can't understand why it's present in Dota though. When considering how to make Dota a better esport, it's important to consider how changes to make the game more competitive or fair can impact the fun factor of the game. I don't believe removing this small amount of randomness would be a detriment to the enjoyment, however, and I'd wager if this stuff was silently pulled out of the game so that heroes did a specific non-random amount of damage on each attack, most players probably wouldn't even notice. If random elements can be removed without impacting how enjoyable the game is to play, they should be, for the sake of making the game more fair in competitive matches. The next random element is how the high ground advantage is handled. In many strategy games, the terrain can impart bonuses like this, which is great. It definitely improves the amount of strategy present in the game and makes positioning more important. Vision is restricted up onto the high ground so that the player attacking from the low ground is at an inherent disadvantage. Additionally, when attacking from the low ground, attacks have a 25% chance to miss their target, doing no damage. Where this comes into play the most is for the characters in the middle lane, where early on in the game they might need to attempt some last hits up the ramp. It's not unreasonable to say that a player could potentially miss around 4 last hits early on in the game if they get unlucky with this mechanic. In other words, the player could attempt to get a last hit at exactly the right time on each creep, however the attack randomly misses so they get no gold. Now imagine an alternate universe where the player is a bit more lucky, they don't miss any of those 4 last hits. Even though both players did the exact same thing, the difference between those two scenarios is about 150 gold. 150 gold that much sooner can be the difference between having a life-saving item in time or not. It can be the difference between living and dying. It can be the difference between getting a kill and letting an opponent get away. Even though this 25% miss rate seems like a fairly harmless mechanic taken by itself, the knock-on effects it can have on a game can be very meaningful. The worst case scenario with the current low ground disadvantage is that a player might miss the final attack they need on an enemy hero, and although this would only happen very rarely, it can be a totally game-changing outcome. It's also disappointing to think that two players playing the exact same way could have very different outcomes based solely on a random number generator. An alternative to this would be a flat percentage-based damage reduction when attacking up a cliff. This keeps the low ground at a disadvantage but allows the player to account for it. So instead of crossing their fingers and hoping, a player can take control of the situation and adjust their timing accordingly. The next and arguably largest random element in the game are the runes. There are 5 types: regen, illusion, haste, invisibility, and double damage. Runes spawn every 2 minutes at one of 2 locations. They can spawn at either location randomly, and a type of rune is also randomized. The only rule is that the same type can't spawn twice in a row. This mechanic would make more sense to me if runes spawned in a fixed pattern. That might sound like it would make the game stale, but when I think about this I inevitably think about competitive Quake matches. Power-ups exist in Quake as well, but the location, type and respawn time of each power-up is fixed. Games often revolve around these power-ups. They act as a way of forcing conflict between the players and make positioning more important. You could argue the same could be said of Dota, but the runes are much less important because players don't know what one they'll be getting ahead of time or which location it will spawn at. If the value of a rune isn't known in advance, then a team can't make a reasonable decision about whether they should try to get it or not. Once again, this random element could have a big snowballing effect. I'd say most people who have played Dota have experienced a moment where they were running to the river and hoping that a certain rune would be in their path. Sometimes you desperately want a haste rune to get away, sometimes you need a regen rune to get back into a fight. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Imagine a situation where the player needs to escape along the river. In one scenario they get a regen rune, but they have a damage over time effect on them and it's almost immediately cancelled. They're unable to get away from the enemy team and they end up dead. In another scenario they might run across a haste rune and escape alive. 30 seconds later a team fight happens. Now in one scenario the player is alive and in another they're dead. That can be the difference between winning and losing a team fight, which can be the difference between winning and losing a game. Dota has so many various mechanics at play that it's easy for knock-on effects like this to be masked, but even if you ignore the domino effect that things like this can start, a hero kill is a large enough thing in and of itself that it shouldn't be left to chance. Certain skills in the game also have largely random elements. Phantom Assassin provides perhaps the cleanest example. Her ultimate, Coup de Grace, is a passive ability which grants her a 15% chance to deal a critical strike for 4.5 times her normal damage. This is something the player has no control over. All they can do is increase her attack speed in the hopes of allowing Coup de Grace to happen more often. Dota 2 used to use flat percentage base values for the random elements on skills, by which I mean Phantom Assassin always had a 15% chance to trigger Coup de Grace. Recently this was changed to be more like Dota 1 by using a pseudo-random distribution. What this means is that a player's chance to get a critical strike starts out at less than 15%. For each consecutive attack which doesn't trigger the crit, the percentage rises. The percentage quickly goes over 15% until a crit happens, in which case the chance resets back to its original value below 15%. The reason it works this way is to prevent long lucky or unlucky streaks. The effective rate of critical strikes is still around 15%, but it's less likely to trigger twice in a row and less likely to go a long time without triggering. This system of changing percentages might sound better in theory, but it does have downsides of its own. If a player does 5 attacks on creeps and realises that their critical strike hasn't occurred, they now know that the chance to crit on the next attack is much higher than 15%. This knowledge could be used to make sure crits are used more often on enemy heroes where they'll be put to best use. Unlike the small random element on each hero's attack, which I feel is incredibly pointless, I'd have to admit that critical strikes are inherently fun to get. Getting a massive attack bonus and watching the enemy health vanish while blood splatters everywhere is very satisfying. You could argue the enemy suffers an equal and opposite amount of frustration as a result, but removing these skills would definitely impact the enjoyment of some heroes. An alternative to both the random and pseudo-random percentages already exists in the game. Bounty Hunter's Janata is one example of an entirely separate mechanic. After leveling up Janata, Bounty Hunter gets a passive, periodic critical strike which goes back on cooldown for a few seconds after it's used. This synergizes well with his invisibility, as it means breaking invisibility usually results in a Janata strike, but the real benefit this has is that it takes the critical strike and puts it in the player's hands rather than the random number generator. Players can plan their Janatas ahead of time, and even though the randomness is removed, the satisfaction of getting a critical strike is left intact. There's a lot of percentage chance based skills in Dota, and even many of the items function in a similar fashion. I don't think it would make sense to use a Janata like mechanic for all of them, but it is an option which could probably be considered more often, and shows that there may be other ways to implement critical damage which don't rely on luck. Creep camps are another area of Dota left to look. Mostly this isn't much of an issue, especially if each team has a jungler. Killing a large amount of jungle creeps will pretty much even out any randomness over the course of the game. The Ancients are a bit less forgiving though. The difference between an Ancient Golem camp and an Ancient Dragon camp works out to be about 70 gold on average. If the camps are being stacked up, this opens up more room for luck to play a role. Getting a few Dragon camps in the stack can increase the gold earned by a couple hundred compared to some unlucky spawns. It's not that this is a particularly bad mechanic. By the time heroes will be taking down Ancient creeps, 70 gold isn't a very notable figure. That said, there's no reason the camps couldn't just spawn in sequence instead. The weakest Ancients could spawn first and eventually lead up to the dragons and then reset, or vice versa. Again, this would give teams a chance to plan ahead of time and make decisions based on fact rather than guesswork. It's worth noting as well that the amount of gold given for every creep kill in the game is also slightly randomized, which I find to be totally unnecessary. That covers most if not all the random elements in Dota. As I've said, some of these issues are bigger than others. The randomized gold on the creeps would generally not be that big a deal as it would average out over the game. Landing a 4-second stun instead of a 2-second stun as Chaos Knight is a big deal though. I definitely feel most of these could be removed or changed without impacting the enjoyment most people would have when playing. Giving the runes and creep camps fixed spawning patterns would also help the game expand beyond one map, as these elements could be changed in the next map, adding a little more variety. The Fog of War is the next major issue I have with Dota 2 as a competitive game. This is a holdover from other strategy games. After all, Dota was born from the Warcraft 3 map editor, so it's not surprising it features plenty of similarities. The map is split into 3 lanes, and each team's creeps provide vision on that lane. This makes a lot of sense to me. If the lane is pushed forward, the team gains an advantage by being able to see further forward. The problem here is that even with these creeps and 5 heroes, there will still be massive gaps in the vision. This results in pro teams having dedicated support players who are mainly supposed to buy the courier, place wards, stack and pull creep camps, and otherwise support the team whatever way they can. They essentially take a hit for the team right from the get-go. In a sense, even in other strategy games, the Fog of War introduces an element of chance by itself, but I find it far more problematic in this game than I do in RTS games. The massive gaps in vision I mentioned earlier are usually in the jungles and the river. The river is often warded, and the clearest example of teams using wards to mitigate randomness, since this covers the rune spot and also warns of incoming ganks on the lanes. Vision on the river is pretty essential early on. It gets more messy later in the game, however, when the teams start roaming more and the lanes begin to push back and forth. One of the main reasons I think the Fog of War is so punishing in Dota is because every hero is valuable, and even player controlled units often have a large amount of value associated with them. Illusions can be a cheap way of scouting but have an inherent time limit. This runs in opposition to the majority of strategy games in general. Take StarCraft 2 as an example. Say a player feels trapped in their base and lacks map control. One option they have would be to send out a single probe to a nearby watchtower to get a better idea of what's going on. The very act of sending the probe out of the base is a guess. The player has no idea what the probe is about to run into. But since they're constantly manufacturing them and they only cost 50 minerals, it's an acceptable risk. Acceptable risks are hard to come by in Dota apart from the wards, but wards themselves have some issues. Both ward types are invisible, with one granting vision and one granting true sight, which for those who have never played is the ability to see invisible things. The true sight wards can be used to spot invisible heroes, but they're also used for dewarding, which is the act of destroying the enemy's wards. Let's say you're playing a game and you get the feeling that the river is warded because the enemy team pulled back before a gank was about to happen. You might ask the support to deward that location. Going there to drop a true sight ward is essentially a gamble. Maybe they don't have that location warded at all, or maybe they have a ward in a nearby place but just out of reach of your true sight ward. If you drop it in the wrong place, you've essentially lost money for nothing. The very fact that all ward types are invisible makes them a gamble. One of the things I love about strategy games is the fact that players can change their play based on what they know the enemy knows, or even better than that, play mind games with the enemy's knowledge. Say for example sending an illusion to one lane and then immediately ganking in another. Dota makes this much harder to do because neither team is ever really sure what areas are warded and how much the enemy team knows at any given time. To use StarCraft as an example again, neither player can ever see the other without giving at least some indication that they have vision there. In the case of burrowed units, it's extremely subtle, but it is there, and detection is a more prominent element of that game in general. This is an important part of mind games, and without it, everything is guesswork as to the enemy's knowledge. Smoke of Deceit is an item which adds another layer of complexity and guesswork to the whole warding setup. If there's any item in Dota which shows how the game has evolved more by bolting things on than by refining them, it's Smoke of Deceit, which is sort of a counter to wards and again, invisible. I'm going to explain this one for anyone who hasn't played. This is a consumable item which turns the user and any allied heroes nearby invisible. As soon as they come within range of an enemy hero, they become visible again. If you've never played Dota, this might sound useless, but really the point isn't to deny enemy heroes vision, it's to deny enemy wards vision. Since the heroes only become visible when they get near an enemy, they can move by wards undetected. But here's where things get messy again. True sight wards will actually reveal the smoked units, so if you walk past a normal ward you're undetected, but if you walk past a true sight one your cover is blown. Keep in mind both ward types are invisible, and if the players actually knew where the enemy wards were, they wouldn't need Smoke of Deceit in the first place. I really feel like the Fog of War and the relationship it has with the support players could do with some closer examination and improvement. Wards were recently made cheaper, but this feels like a band-aid solution to me. I feel that supports, at best, need a better and more skill-intensive way to scout the map and deny the enemy's vision. Perhaps by providing them with some kind of vulnerable pet which can scout on their behalf. Even something as simple as making regular wards visible but making it so they can only be removed by a support player somehow might go a long way towards improving this situation. The layout of the map itself is also a source of some concern for me. It's a strange mix of symmetry and asymmetry. Usually in RTS games the multiplayer maps are mirrored to ensure that neither player has any sort of advantage when the game starts. The map in Dota has largely the same layout for both sides, but with a myriad of small differences. I'll go through a few of them now. The easy camp for Radiant is much closer to the mid lane than it is for the Dire. The Dire jungle in general is smaller, so it's easy to farm more quickly than the Radiant. The Radiant jungle also has a ward location which can block 2 camps at once. There's no equivalent for the Dire jungle, even though the Dire jungle is smaller than the Radiant one. The high ground ward spot near each base is also very different. On the Dire side, this is very easy to access and gives vision of the lane and the main entrances to the jungle. On the Radiant side, this is largely closed off by trees and doesn't give vision of either of the nearby lanes. Also, if you're playing Nature's Prophet, you can teleport onto the Radiant high ground and kill creeps without the risk of taking damage, whereas the Dire side lacks the ability to do this. The ancient creep camps are also in much different locations. From mid lane, the Radiant need to wander around and up onto the high ground, whereas the Dire need to go through the river. The positioning also seems slightly different for creep waves on top and bottom. Blocking the Radiant safe lane will result in enemy creeps wandering into your tower, which causes the lane to rebound. Blocking creeps on the Dire side won't bring the enemy creeps in range unless you do a very good job. In other words, the creep wave on the Radiant safe lane starts off closer to the tower than it does for the Dire. All these minor differences pale in comparison to the biggest asymmetrical aspect of the map, Roshan. Since Dota's map uses roughly rotational symmetry where the Dire safe lane is on top and the Radiant safe lane is on the bottom, there is only one place where Roshan could sit in order to be completely balanced, the centre. Instead, Roshan sits near the centre on the Dire side of the river. I believe it's fairly obvious this makes Roshan favourable for the Dire, especially in the early game. If we look at the map, it becomes much clearer. The nearest tower for Dire are these 3, they're all fairly close by. The nearest towers for Radiant are these 3, much further away. Now imagine 2 teams get into a fight over Roshan and one team decides to retreat. If that team is Dire, they don't have far to run before the towers provide them with some backup. If they're Radiant, they'll have much further to go before they'll start to feel comfortable. This is even worse when you consider another scenario. Say one team heads in to do Roshan and the other team wants to try and stop it. They need to teleport to the closest tower and walk the rest of the way. The nearest towers for Dire make this much easier. If the Radiant need to get to Roshan in a hurry, they have a lot of walking to do. It's also obviously much easier for the Dire to scout Roshan, and some heroes like Keeper of the Light or Vengeful Spirit can use their abilities from the relative safety of their secret shop to tell if any enemy team members are in the Roshan pit. Sometimes teams will hesitate for a long time to fight each other, either at the tower or outside Roshan. If this happens for the Dire, they can occupy themselves by killing the nearby ancient creeps to give their carry more farm. The Radiant don't have any such option. Even the normal jungle creeps are further away. If this situation lasts a couple of minutes, the Dire carry can gain hundreds of gold compared to the Radiant carry. As I've said earlier, with the current map layout, the only way to make Roshan balanced would be to place him in the centre. Since that would place him in the middle of a lane, that's not really an option. One alternative, which would require alterations to the map, is to divide Roshan in 2 and place him in 2 separate, opposite locations. I'm not a big fan of this idea either. I like Roshan as a concept. The reward he provides a team is a good way to ensure that any team with enough map control has a fairly surefire way of cementing their lead. Without this massive bonus, games would be more likely to drag themselves out. I can't help but feel that dividing Roshan in 2 would dilute this benefit a lot. I'm not really sure what else can be done, but small changes to the layout of Roshan's pit in the hopes of making it more fair won't satisfy me. A lot of my complaints about the map could be seen as petty, and maybe some of them are, but the problem is when I watch strategy games like StarCraft, I never need to worry about this stuff in the slightest. Apart from the Roshan issue, which is pretty big, I don't think anyone is genuinely all that worried about tiny differences on each side of the map, but it's a possibility which still nags at the brain. Look at something like this and compare it to Dota. Each player starts out with exactly the same state. Not kind of, sort of similar, exactly the same. This is a pattern you can see all the way back to ancient board games like Go or chess, and even in physical sports. The playing field really needs to be the same to convince us beyond a shadow of a doubt that the match is fair. One thing also true for most, if not all, of those old board games is that the players are given the exact same pieces. This doesn't hold true for Dota 2. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this is a common thing for strategy games. One of the main draws for the original StarCraft, which helped it gain so much momentum, was the asymmetrical gameplay. The three races weren't just superficially different from each other, they had entirely different units, methods of building their structures, and ways of regenerating their health. At any given time, it's impossible to tell for certain whether Terran, Protoss or Zerg are the best race in the game. That can be said of Dota 2. Even though it may appear one hero or combination of heroes is imbalanced at a certain time, there's nothing to say a better combination doesn't exist in theory. The truth is, it would be close to impossible to keep all 100 or so heroes in Dota perfectly balanced with each other, so the competitive scene is always going to work more like a fighting game, where some characters are picked constantly and some are picked rarely. Invoker is an example of a hero picked or banned very regularly in the Dota 2 scene so far, and while I can't definitively prove he's imbalanced, I can at least say his design is somewhat problematic. Invoker has 10 spells as opposed to the usual maximum of 4, and casting those spells requires the use of 3 reagents. As a result, Invoker is commonly agreed to be one of the most difficult heroes to play. Therein lies the problem. If Invoker is significantly more difficult to play than the average hero, then he needs to provide more than the average hero to compensate for that. If Invoker was perfectly balanced with all the other heroes, then there wouldn't be much reason to pick him. Keep in mind I'm talking purely from a competitive standpoint here. I actually find Invoker a lot of fun to play and probably would play him from time to time even if he was made less useful than he is currently. If I was the captain of a pro team though and Invoker was just as powerful as any other hero, what incentive would I have to pick him? Picking him just leaves the person playing him with a larger burden than the rest of the team for no reward. That player is more likely to make mistakes and drag the team down. Invoker has more utility and more ways that he can be played than any other hero. This would be fine if the game wasn't played competitively, since most average players wouldn't be able to get the most out of him anyway. But when you're talking about people who dedicate their life to this stuff, of course they're going to be able to play Invoker competently, and so they'll be able to reap the benefits of that. I don't think there's been any point since Invoker was released in Dota 2 where he's been considered the absolute most powerful hero, but he is consistently up there. It's exactly Invoker's difficulty which makes him hard if not impossible to balance when compared to the other heroes. Most heroes won't have these kind of problems when it comes to balance, but the balance is always ongoing, and considering how long Dota has had to perfect this kind of stuff, the number of heroes which are viable at a pro level isn't exactly astounding. It could be a lot worse, but it could be a lot better as well. The last thing I'd like to talk about are the cosmetic items. Before I start on that though, I want to say that Valve have absolutely done the right thing in not allowing any competitive advantages to be purchased from the shop and making it so every hero is unlocked for all players. That said, I still worry about the future of the Dota 2 store, and yes, this relates to the competitive aspect of the game. Dota 2 can require some surprisingly fast reaction times in order to stay alive. Players already need to know 100 heroes and what they're capable of, and they need to be able to read those heroes instantly. At the moment, the cosmetics in Dota 2 are pretty good. Some are better than others, but on the whole they adhere to the basic visuals of the game much better than the items in Team Fortress 2. I think what some people forget though is that Team Fortress 2 started out with pretty good items as well, and it went slowly downhill over time. It was a gradual erosion. Some class got a silly hat, so the next silly hat was okay because hey, we've done that before. Then eventually a promotional tie-in is okay, and another, until eventually the wonderful and extremely refined art style which began Team Fortress 2, which endeared many of the people to the game in the first place, has been covered in virtual graffiti. Anyway, my point here is that there's nothing in place to stop the same thing from happening to Dota 2 over time. I think at some point Valve realised TF2 was a lost cause when it came to restricting items, but they seem to want to stop the same thing from happening with Dota 2. They say they'll take community feedback on these issues and try to only allow items which fit the aesthetic. This doesn't make any sense though, since players will still vote for poorly fitting items anyway. They don't have a clue how to manage the art in the game, that's a professional's job. If this kind of gradual slide starts to occur in Dota, it will make it harder and harder for people to make those kind of snap decisions they need to make when they see an enemy hero. Milliseconds count, and every piece of ill-fitting cosmetics that a character wears makes them that much less readable. Even worse, some items have custom particle effects or animations. Even if all the animations, sounds and particle effects are equally as good as each other, the sheer number could easily become overwhelming. Imagine a day when Sand King's Epicenter has 8 different channeling animations and you'll see the problem. If there ever comes a day when you can, for even half a second, mistake one character or ability for another, then Dota is starting to break, and it's damn near impossible to reverse that process since people will have invested money in all their items. The simplest solution here is to allow custom games to turn off the cosmetic items, and rather than put this option in the hands of tournament organisers, I would give the decision to the teams themselves by leaving a veto button for both teams in the captain's pick mode. If one team presses the veto button, then the game starts without cosmetics. At least that way the teams have a backup plan if they ever feel the cosmetics have gotten out of control to the point where it might detriment their play. Before I close out, I think it's only fair I at least briefly mention some of the fantastic ways that Dota 2 supports its competitive scene. The team pennants are a nice way for players to show support for their favourite team, and it's great that the team actually sees some margin on that. There's also some nice in-game space for the teams to promote themselves and their sponsors. It's a shame that so many of these end up looking ugly, but at least it's a great idea. The replay system is also incredibly robust. I was particularly impressed by how easy it is to skip halfway into a match, and the directed view is well polished, rarely missing anything of importance. Viewers can also buy tickets to tournaments and watch live games with commentary right inside the game client, which severely reduces the dependence of the Dota scene on external streaming sites. Apparently there's also plans to support LAN play down the line. Provided that gets implemented, the only missing feature I can think of which teams would benefit from would be the ability to load up replays and go through them as a group. Considering how polished the replay system is, I imagine this is something Valve probably have planned for the future. As far as I'm concerned, all these features eclipse any other game I've played when it comes to supporting the competitive scene. The only problems I have are actually within the game itself. So those are some of my thoughts on Dota 2 as a competitive game. From what I've seen, I think it's the most polished ARTS game on the market, and in that sense I hope it succeeds. Dota 2 is largely a clone of Dota 1, and in a lot of ways that's a decision which makes sense for Valve. Counter-Strike 1.6 is still to this day the most popular version of that game, so you can imagine they would be hesitant to make any changes to Dota at all since they want that player base to transfer over. It's also understandable since Dota has never gotten its chance until now to be anything other than a mod. It's nice that something so successful finally gets to stand as its own entity. The downside to all this is Valve have ignored the chance to take the original Dota and improve on the core gameplay. There certainly is room for improvement, especially when considering the map differences and random elements which have no need to exist. So far, Valve have clearly spent more time and resources pushing the game as an esport than they have improving the game as an esport. That may be the best thing for the success of Dota 2 as a competitive game, just don't expect me to take it seriously.